guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm sorry we ran out of space. We thought this would be popular, but we didn't realize it'd be this popular. Just a quick note, there is a camera right there, and there are two cameras right there. So thank you to everyone who came today in person. There's a lot of you. And then everyone who's streaming live through our Facebook and Instagram platforms. After today's talk, Mechelle is going to be taking some questions. We hope that those of you watching here and then also those of you watching online will send in questions via comment, and we will be able to share those with her and you'll be able to see her answer. So just a little bit about Mechelle. She started working with the Greenwood Cultural Center in 1996 as a receptionist, and she worked her way all the way up to becoming the program coordinator and official tour guide for the center. She is now their on-site historian. When the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot, now Massacre, Centennial Commission was created, she was a natural fit as a member and contributor to their education committee, which they worked to develop resources to educate Tulsans, Oklahomans, and the nation about the events of 1921 and the historic Greenwood district. So please welcome our guest speaker, Mechelle Brown.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you today and to share the history of Black Wall Street and the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Back in 1996, we began to identify race riot survivors, and at that time, we were able to identify more than 162 survivors, individuals who many of them were quite young, but remembered something about the massacre itself or about Black Wall Street. Individuals like Otis Clark, who was 16 years old at the time of the massacre, and other individuals who, when we began the discussion about reparations a few years later, were questioned, approached by several reporters who said, "We know that you want something. Just what exactly do you want?" And they said, of course, we believe that reparations are due for everything that our families lost, their homes, their businesses. But what we want more than anything is for our children and grandchildren to finally know that there is more to Black history than slavery and the civil rights movement. So what we do continues to be important because our race riot survivors felt that it was important that we began to have the conversation about what truly happened in 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In the late 19th century, African Americans began to migrate to Tulsa, what became Tulsa, Oklahoma. Many of them were Native American freedmen. Some of them were wealthy when they moved into the area. O.W. Gurley, who is credited with being the founder of Black Wall Street, removed himself from a presidential appointment by President Grover Cleveland to move into what became Tulsa. He was a wealthy landowner from Arkansas, and he bought 40 acres of land at the corner of Greenwood and Archer, where some of the buildings still exist. And he decided that of that property that he had purchased, he would divide those plots and only sell them to other African Americans. As African Americans moved into the area, they began to build their homes and businesses along the Greenwood district. The first law that Oklahoma passed when it became a state was the Jim Crow law, which segregated the races. So African Americans, while they were building their businesses and their homes, while they had needs, they were forced to spend their dollars within their own community. It's rumored that the dollar would circulate as many as 19 times in the Greenwood district before being spent outside of the community. Anything you could imagine wanting or needing in the Greenwood district, they had in 1921. Hotels, J.B. Stratford built a hotel which was believed to be one of the largest African-American owned hotels in the country. Movie theaters, restaurants. There were more than 15 doctors. Dr. A.C. Jackson was housed in the Greenwood district. The Mayo brothers called him one of the most able Negro surgeons in America, and he was located in the Greenwood district. Attorneys such as Buck Franklin, and the list of businesses goes on, electricians and plumbers, all sorts of professionals along the house in the Greenwood district. African Americans were also building their own homes. in the area. And some African Americans also worked for rich white Tulsans as maids and housekeepers. As downtown Tulsa exploded during the oil boom and shortly after, the money from downtown Tulsa would trickle into the Greenwood district. We know that the incident between Dick Rowland and Sarah Page sparked what became a massacre. But we also know that Tulsa was divided at that time. We know that the railroad tracks at the right along Archer and Greenwood today would still serve as somewhat of a dividing line between the city of Tulsa and North Tulsa, which is predominantly African American, was also a dividing line in 1921. We know that many of the people that we would look to for protection and leadership during that time, many of your city officials, police officers and firemen, were also members of the Ku Klux Klan. We know that there was obvious racism in the community and that many whites were envious of how prosperous some African Americans were. Remember, there were millionaires that were housed in the Greenwood district. Simon Berry, who was a private pilot, owned his own plane and developed a jitney service which traveled along the Greenwood district, made as much as $500 a day prior to 1921. So many whites were envious that African Americans were so wealthy and so prosperous, and commented, how dare those Negroes have a grand piano in their house and I don't have one in mine. And African Americans were in fact having furniture and linen and grand pianos shipped to their homes from all over the country. So we do know, however, that there was an incident on May 30th, 1921 between a young black man named Dick Rowland. Dick Rowland had dropped out of high school at Booker T. Washington High School in North Tulsa to shine the shoes of rich white oil men who would come into downtown Tulsa. He had been given special arrangements to visit the Drexel building every day to use water and to use the restroom. Had he not had access to the Drexel building, he would have had to return to the Greenwood district and then travel back to downtown Tulsa to resume his work. Dick Rowland made a lot of money as a shoeshine boy. He made so much that he wore a diamond-encrusted belt buckle. His nickname was Diamond Dick. Sarah Page was a transplant from Kansas City. She had moved to Tulsa to attend school. She also, she was divorced. She worked in the Drexel building as an elevator operator. So it was her job to stand in the elevator every day and operate the lever, which took the elevator from one floor to the next. Every day she would encounter Dick Rowland in the elevator. On this particular day, Dick Rowland went into the elevator, as he did every day. A moment later, the elevator doors closed. There was no one in the elevator but Dick Rowland and Sarah Page. There was a scream, and the elevator doors opened, and Dick Rowland ran. A businessman working in the building came running to see what had happened and started the rumor that Sarah Page had been attacked. As the rumor began to circulate throughout Tulsa, by the end of the day, the rumor had went from she had been attacked to she had been sexually attacked. By the end of the day, they were claiming that she had been raped in broad daylight in the Drexel building in downtown Tulsa. Dick Rowland was later arrested and taken to the jailhouse, which before we built our new jailhouse, David L. Moss, our jail was located right above our courthouse. Dick Rowland was held there, and an article came out in the Tulsa Tribune, which was one of the major newspapers at that time. The article ended by saying, looks like there's going to be a lynching in Tulsa tonight. Lynchings were all too common in Tulsa. Prior to this incident, a white man had been lynched in front of the courthouse/jailhouse while the police directed traffic. Many whites were angry and upset about what had happened, and they were determined to take matters into their own hands. They began to gather in front of the courthouse, demanding that Dick Rowland be released into their custody. The sheriff at that time, Sheriff McCullough, was a new sheriff and was determined to keep Dick Rowland safe. So when about 40 African-American men many of them homeowners and business owners, approached the sheriff and offered their services. They said, we're here, we'd like to help protect Dick Rowland. They intended to position themselves in the stairwell leading up to the jail. The sheriff at the time told them to go on back to Greenwood, that he had everything under control and that Dick Rowland would be fine. So they did return to Greenwood. But some estimates have it that there were several thousand whites that had gathered in front of the jailhouse by the end of the evening, angry and upset about what had happened. They had armed themselves and they were determined to take matters into their own hands. The African American community, who believed that Dick Rowland was innocent, who stated that we have the opportunity to save this young man's life, gathered together again, this time about 100 African American men, some of them armed and rightfully so, went to the courthouse to once again offer to help protect Dick Rowland. This time, however, a white man approached a black man with a gun. He said, what are you going to do with that gun? He said, I'm going to use it if I have to. And they began to struggle over the gun. And during the struggle, the gun went off. And at that point, it was no longer about Dick Rowland or Sarah Page. There was an all-out battle in front of the courthouse. Blacks retreated to the Greenwood district, where they were able to position themselves in some strategic locations like Standpipe Hill. They were able to defend their community for some time, but because they were so outnumbered and outgunned, eventually white rioters broke through those barriers and invaded the Greenwood district. The police department deputized many of the white rioters. Whites began to go into the homes of African Americans and take whatever belongings they wanted, go into their businesses, and simply set everything on fire. The National Guard was eventually called in, and they were told that there was a Negro uprising and that Negroes were killing innocent, unarmed whites. And so they came and, along with the white police force and the white rioters who had been deputized, began to remove African Americans from the Greenwood district. The entire population of the African American community at that time was 10 to 12,000 men, women, and children. Individuals were forcibly removed from their homes and businesses. Many people lost their lives during that day. And one of the most popular questions is how many people actually lost their life. We know that they immediately began to arrest African American families and take them to several internment centers where they held them against their will. They said it was to keep their homes, that it was for their defense, it was for their protection. But what it did was to leave their homes and businesses defenseless. There were as many as 6,000 African Americans held in these centers, which left 46,000 people unaccounted for. We know that the American Red Cross rendered aid to many of the victims of the massacre. And if during my conversation, my presentation, you'll sometimes hear me revert to Riot, because I've been sharing the story now for about 20 years, and initially in '96, we referred to it as the Tulsa Race Riot, as every other incident similar to this one that took place between 1919 during Red Summer and the years that followed was referred to as a race riot. But in our community, we are making a conscious effort to refer to this as what it actually was, to refer to it in a way that is more historically accurate. This was a massacre. The Tulsa Race Riot Commission, Centennial Commission, which was formed several years ago, actually changed their name to the Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission, and the public school system in Tulsa has made a commitment to refer to this as a massacre. So historically speaking, while it's been referred to as a riot, and I sometimes out of habit refer to it as a riot, I want you to know that we are making an effort and appreciate everyone who is willing to recognize this for what it actually was, which was a massacre. In 1921, following the massacre 4,000 to 6,000 people are being held. That leaves 4,000 to 6,000 people unaccounted for. We know that there were African Americans that fled the Greenwood district that simply never returned. J.B. Stratford was one of those business owners and homeowners that fled and relocated in Chicago and never returned to the Greenwood district. But we also know that there are several mass grave sites. We know that Oak Lawn Cemetery is the location for one of those sites. And years ago, we worked with a world-renowned scientist named Dr. Richard Snow. He did some preliminary investigative work in that cemetery and decided that he believed that there was a mass grave site in the cemetery. That effort was launched in part to the testimony of a white man who, as a young boy, had been playing near the cemetery and witnessed bodies on top of bodies being buried in the cemetery there. Before we were able to actually go into the cemetery and begin to complete the research, the city of Tulsa changed their mind and said that they did not want to disturb the other graves in the area that may have had nothing to do with the massacre. More recently, our current mayor, G.T. Bynum, has relaunched that investigation into Oak Lawn Cemetery and into several other sites that are considered to be the home of mass grave sites. There's also an area near Pryor, I believe. We spoke with a gentleman named Sheriff Johnson several months ago who has a cemetery in their city and commented that they, for years, identified a location in their cemetery that they believed was a mass grave site where victims of the massacre were buried. And so we're hoping that as more evidence comes forward and more people begin to step forward with information, that we will be able to identify other mass grave sites. Eventually, after the massacre took place, African Americans who were held in those internment camps, some for several days, some were for several weeks, they were forced to wear a green identification badge before being, as they were being released, which said what they were allowed to do, who was responsible for them. Eventually, they released them so that they could return to the Greenwood district. And some of these photographs and this traveling exhibit here, courtesy of the Tulsa Historical Society, you can see photographs of the Greenwood district in the aftermath that shows just how completely devastated the area was. In a single day, more than 1,000 homes were burned to the ground, 35 square blocks of property completely destroyed, 300 businesses destroyed, and at least several hundred people that had lost their lives. Many people believe that following the massacre, that was the end of the Greenwood district, that was the end of Black Wall Street, that the story ends with the massacre of 1921, and that simply isn't the truth. The story of Black Wall Street is a story of resilience and courage, strength and determination, because by 1925, African Americans, many of the individuals that had decided that they would stay in the Greenwood district and rebuild their homes and businesses in the same location. By 1925, they had completely rebuilt the Greenwood district. And we saw the return of hundreds of Black-owned businesses, the hotels, the movie theaters, the restaurants, the jazz and blues clubs. It was said that people like Louis Armstrong and Nat King Cole, who were not allowed to eat or sleep in downtown Tulsa after having been brought in to perform, would return to the Greenwood district. So it wasn't unusual on Thursday, which was Maid's Day off, to go into a jazz club or blues club and see someone like Nat King Cole or Louis Armstrong playing with the local musicians. By 1925, Black Wall Street was rebuilt and survived, existed up until the late 60s, the early 70s. So now when you visit the Greenwood district, people often ask, well, what happened to Black Wall Street if they rebuilt following the massacre. And there were several things that happened. One was the end of segregation, and the money that had circulated in the Greenwood district up to 19 times was now being spent outside of the community. And when we spoke with some of our survivors and we asked why they began spending their money outside of the community, they commented that it wasn't that the products or the services was any better. It was simply that now we had an opportunity to spend our money in a white-owned establishment, and we wanted to know what that felt like. We wanted to experience that, not understanding the impact that it would have on the small businesses in the Greenwood district. The city of Tulsa built the expressway through the heart of the Greenwood district, which caused property values to decline. Businesses one by one began to relocate outside of the Greenwood district, and eventually urban renewal came through with a promise to help rebuild the Greenwood district. And that is, in fact, not what happened. Today, at the corner of Greenwood and Archer, we have a remnant of what once was a handful of structures that are there. However, we do have the plans and the intent and the work of many organizations and individuals to rebuild the Greenwood district. As we approach the Centennial in 2021, we are part of the Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission, whose work is to help rebuild the Greenwood district. They have initiated a capital campaign to raise $15 million, and part of that funding will be used to help renovate the Greenwood Cultural Center. The Greenwood Cultural Center has existed for more than 20 years and has been one of the few sites where you could go and learn about this part of our history. For years, unfortunately, people did not know anything about Black Wall Street or a massacre. Even being native to Tulsa, being an African American, being part of Black history classes, we never talked about Black Wall Street. We never talked about the massacre. My mother, who is from Yuma, Arizona, a border town in Arizona, moved here in 1970 and worked for an elderly white gentleman who, on his deathbed, murmured about the shooting and the burning and the killing. And she asked some of her in-laws, what was he talking about? And they said, we don't talk about that around here, and don't go asking anybody about it. And that was pretty much the mentality in the community. We don't really talk about it. When we asked our race riot survivors, why would you not share this part of history with your children and grandchildren? Many of them said that following the massacre, when they came home to absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs, but they had children to provide for, they had to think about shelter, they had to think about surviving, that there were in fact more churches in North Tulsa than all of Tulsa combined. They had a strong foundation in their faith, and their faith had taught them to simply put this in God's hands, that reliving the story, retelling the story was too hurtful, that they still experienced emotions. They still dealt with fear and anger and resentment and bitterness, and they didn't want to live in that. They wanted to focus on rebuilding and on surviving and on moving forward. One of our race riot survivors said, I wanted my children and grandchildren to have the opportunity to judge people based on their character and not based on this part of history. So many individuals in Tulsa, in Oklahoma, throughout our nation, are still unaware of this part of our history or know little about it. The work of the Centennial Commission has included creating a curriculum that is available and has been adopted by the Oklahoma State Department of Education so that our teachers are better equipped with an actual curriculum with lesson plans that they can use in the classroom. Our mission in part, our job, our goal, is always to continue to educate people about this important part of our history. It's not just Black history. This is a part of Tulsa's history. This is a part of Oklahoma's history. This is a part of our nation's history. And there's a great deal that we can learn from the experiences of African Americans during the massacre, the strength and determination, the courage that it took to build the Greenwood district and then to rebuild it by 1921. I am here. I know that Mechelle has an announcement that she would like to make, but I'm definitely open to questions.
Yeah, we're going to take questions for the next couple of minutes. Does anybody have questions they'd like to ask Mechelle? Anybody in the hallways? Oh yeah, go ahead.
What can we do to help? What are the steps we need to take to make this happen faster?
Thank you for that. There are several things that you can do, and one is to simply begin to have the conversation, to speak with people within your circle, to identify those individuals that are not aware of this history. We can speak with educators. If we have children in school systems, we can make sure that their teachers are talking about this in their classrooms. While it has been mandated that educators talk about this in their history classes, they have a lot of leeway. Many of the textbooks still don't have much information about this part of our history, so that we can make sure that our classrooms are talking about this history, and we can simply share the information. So the Centennial Commission has a website, tulsa2021.org, and there are ways that you can be a part of the Centennial Commission and help during the planning process as we move towards the Centennial. But the most important thing is that we continue to have this conversation and be a part of, support these type of activities. Yes, ma'am.
What's the plan after you decide or start going to the grave sites? And
the plan is to identify those sites and to create, to establish some type of marker that recognizes those sites as mass grave sites. That's one of the plans, and I think one of the most important things that we would like to see happen, that those grave sites should be identified and should be marked to show respect for the victims that are buried there, and to hopefully bring some closure for the families and for the community. The community is still suffering from, I think, a historical trauma as a result of this history. We're working with Dr. Stephen Byers from NSU to conduct a historical trauma research project in North Tulsa, interviewing African Americans in North Tulsa that have been impacted by this part of their history. So we're hoping to work towards healing and reconciliation, and part of that would include identifying those mass grave sites. Yes, sir.
So are there plans to identify the bodies inside the grave sites as who they are, or just identify that the sites exist?
That would be ideal. We don't know enough about the technology that's available to know if that's a possibility. I think that they are still in the planning process as the city of Tulsa itself, identifying who should be a part of those discussions, who should be a part of that work. But if that was at all possible, that would be ideal. Yes, sir.
Why has it taken Tulsa so long to even recognize the importance of the actions in 1920?
That's a great question, and the fact that we have just began to really acknowledge it speaks volumes. Personally, I think that we should be a lot farther along in our move towards reconciliation, but with reconciliation, there must be some form of reparations. The city of Tulsa, initially, the reports that were issued in the local media said that there were maybe 30, 35 people that had been killed. They really attempted to minimize what had happened. The city of Tulsa did not want to be known as the place where our nation's worst massacre had occurred. Not in Tulsa, in the Bible Belt of America, not where you have an abundance of churches and ministers and Christian folk. There couldn't have been a massacre that took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but in fact, it did. And we think that part of it is just the resistance of so many people to actually acknowledge that this happened and then to think about how do we deal with this as a community? How do we move forward as a community? And it's part of the reason why the commission was formed in 2001, I believe, to study the events of the riot, because what we relied on was a lot of oral histories, and they wanted to determine what was fact. And they were able to do so. State Representative Don Ross, who is one of my personal heroes, he is a retired state legislator. He was chair of the Appropriations Committee, a state representative. And when the state legislature began to discuss the Oklahoma City bombing and how it was the worst act of terrorism on U.S. soil up to that point by a U.S. citizen, he brought up the history of the Tulsa massacre and had the platform where he was able to bring attention to this, not only in the city of Tulsa, but in the state and nationally. We began to get national attention after his efforts. So I think that he was instrumental, and others like him, Senator Maxine Horner, who served alongside him, and many others were instrumental in bringing this to light and forcing the city of Tulsa to actually at least acknowledge it. It's been a long road from 1996 when I first became involved and we first began to identify survivors to the point where we are now, where we seem to be making some headway. But I think that has a lot to do with why we are where we are now.
We have an online question real quick.
We have a question from our Instagram account. As a criminal justice professional, mainly law enforcement, how do we get involved and set a better example?
That's a great question, because much of the fear that we still feel today, when you think about the relationship between African Americans and police officers, is rooted in the history of the massacre, at least in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so, you know, we're having a discussion in Tulsa about community policing right now and how important that is and how we want to see that in our communities. And there are people in the city of Tulsa and city government and police officers that are working towards that. And so I think any form of community policing is helpful and effective. The presence of police officers in our schools, in our neighborhoods, aside from arresting someone or pulling someone over, them interacting with young people, interacting with residents in a positive manner goes a long ways to helping to bridge the gap and bring about some type of healing.
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay. So was the Race Massacre in Tulsa, was it the worst?
It was the
in
worst.
country? And what other cities or places in the country had something that was perhaps approaching that, or had something?
Well, 1919 was known as Red Summer, and there were similar incidences taking place across the country. So I believe that Chicago had some type of incident. Arkansas, there's new information coming out about an incident in Arkansas took place, and several other places in the South, several other states in the South. I couldn't tell you every single one, but there were a number of other similar incidences, many of them sparked by the same inflammatory accusation that an African-American male had in some way insulted or offended a white female.
Yeah, we know about, I know the one that makes the news a lot is the 14-year-old who was tortured. I can't remember. his
Emmett
name.
Till.
Emmett Till, that's the name, yeah. I know about that. But okay, thank you.
Does anyone know what happened to Dick Rowland or Sarah Page following the massacre? Following the massacre, Dick Rowland was snuck out of the jailhouse, and Sarah Page refused to press charges against Dick Rowland. And many people hold Sarah Page accountable. And I don't. I simply don't, because she had no way of knowing that her scream in the elevator on that day would lead to a massacre. Some type of incident was inevitable because of the climate at that time, because of the tension, because of racism. Some type of confrontation was inevitable. Many whites had commented prior to this incident that something needed to be done with Little Africa, which is what they referred to the Greenwood District as being a cesspool of iniquity. In fact, in one of the newspaper articles following the massacre, it was reported that we had spoken with city officials prior to this incident. We had shared our concerns and nothing had been done. So this wasn't simply a confrontation that got out of hand. There were planes that were used to drop inflammatory devices, incendiaries, fire bombs from the air. We know that the National Guard came and flew overhead, but they said, no, we never dropped bombs. We were simply looking for where African Americans may have been hiding. We were identifying where they may have been so that we could round them up and take them to these internment centers. But we know that at least one oil company allowed white rioters to use their plane to drop bombs overhead. And of course, several of our race riot survivors, before they passed away, testified to seeing bombs dropped on their community. So Sarah Page, who was from Kansas City, reportedly returned to Kansas City, which is also where Dick Rowland was relocated to following the massacre. Dick Rowland, in a letter that he sent to his adopted mother sometime later, reported that he had seen Sarah Page, didn't look well. Sarah Page, as far as we know, never returned to the Greenwood District, never returned to Tulsa, and was never heard from again. No one was ever held accountable for any of the murders of men, women, or children that took place during that day. Several hundred people lost their lives, and not one single person held accountable for the loss of life or the loss of property. Following the massacre, African American home and business owners filed insurance claims that totaled more than $2.7 million in 1921. Every single insurance claim was denied because it did not contain a riot clause. Johnny Cochran, before he passed, agreed to represent the survivors in their search for reparations. And their case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where they were told that it would not be heard because their 2-year statute of limitations had passed. So our survivors passed away without ever having received any form of reparations or any real reconciliation.
One more question.
Do you know the impact or what has been taken from this towards the justice system, maybe that they've done to try to fix the situation, if anything?
I don't know of anything that the justice system has tried to do to repair the situation. And I think that of the efforts that have taken place over the years, it has been, to me, it has seemed to be whites approaching the African American community saying, we'd like to pray with you, or offering some type of event or activity that symbolizes reconciliation while there is really no meaning behind it. So coming together and hugging and holding hands and shaking hands, and no one has yet, as far as I know, come to the African American community and ask, what does reconciliation look like to you? And what needs to happen? I think that we are fortunate enough to have new elected officials. We have a new city council woman, a new state representative, a new state senator, Kevin Matthews, who initiated the Centennial Commission, that are working hard to represent the North Tulsa community. And many of those, many of their concerns, many of their priorities are things that look like reconciliation to us. So that includes economic development, that includes bringing jobs into our community, that includes simply having a grocery store in our community, because we don't have a grocery store. So we are seeing, through the efforts of our newly elected officials, working together with a new mayor, G.T. Bynum, some really important, impactful changes taking place in our community today. I think that we, for the first time in a long time, can see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you very much, Mechelle. We can take more questions after this. And these are two-sided, by the way.
Yes.
So afterwards, you guys are welcome to come up and look at these. But yes, thank you so much. We also have a poll, I think, that will be passed around. If you guys could let us know if you found this useful. Also, another event that's coming up that we thought we would let you know. I believe psychology and sociology are getting together to offer you guys the chance to be bused and have lunch. So transported and have lunch to Langston University, where they are going to be showing the film Resurrecting Black Wall Street.
It's actually a play.
Ah, it's a play.
I'm Dr. Wedding Madison.
Yes. So actually, your email address is on the little sign out front. So if you guys would like to sign up to participate or go to that, please send her an email or talk to her today. Thank you again, Mechelle.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it so much.